The final centuries before the Shattering are remembered as an age of perfect order. Yet beneath the golden radiance that washed across the lands between, the first signs of strain were already gathering like distant thunder. In Laindell, at the height of its power, the Erdtree cast its colossal glow over a kingdom that believed itself unassailable. The city's spires rose in shimmering tiers, each layer a testament to the authority of Mareeka and the brilliance of Radagon, whose presence had become inseparable from the very image of divine law. To the common people, the Golden Order seemed eternal, written not just into scripture, but into the air they breathed and the rhythm of their days. And yet, within the sanctums, where the two fingers murmured inscrutable guidance, and in the shadows, where silent attendants carried out duties never named aloud, it was understood that the sacred design was becoming more fragile with each passing generation. To understand the slow unraveling of this age, we must first remember how deeply the Order depended on unity. Unity between gods, unity between realms, unity between mortal and divine. When Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, was exiled after losing the grace that once crowned him, the world accepted the change without grasping its cost. His departure severed not only a warrior from his throne, but a foundational principle from the heart of the realm. Godfrey embodied the raw, unsoftened strength that the Order once relied upon to confront the unknown. His banishment left behind a silence, a missing note in the chord that once held the lands between together. And though the Golden Order persisted in its rituals and proclamations, Mareeka herself felt the absence most keenly. Some whispered that her choice had been necessary, a sovereign correcting a faltering instrument. Others sensed it as the first moment when her divinity recoiled from the world instead of guiding it. Within the same era, Mickella and Mulaynia grew beneath the radiance of the Erdtree, each one carrying a burden that the realm never truly understood. Mickella, gentle in demeanor yet possessing a determination that radiated like a quiet flame, sought tirelessly to cure the affliction that marked his sister's existence. Mulaynia, whose scarlet rot would one day seep across entire battlefields, spent her childhood trying to outpace the tide that gnawed at her strength. Their bond was one of profound tenderness, but also of shared sorrow. Two divine children who understood that grace alone could not mend what destiny had marred. The Golden Order proclaimed that all things found harmony beneath its canopy, yet here were two of its most sacred heirs, enduring what no blessing could soothe. As the twins struggled beneath their own destinies, another presence was shaping the slow decline of the age. Radagon himself, whose union with Mareeka confounded scholars and priests alike. Was he a consort, a champion, or a mirror dividing the same divine will? The question lingered unanswered as he led armies in the Liurnian Wars, forging peace with Ranni before departing once more to merge into the very heart of the Erdtree. His movements left ripples across every realm he touched. The Carian royals watched the shifting alliances with quiet apprehension, sensing the imbalance beneath the surface. Even among the sorcerers of Raya Lucaria, rumors circulated that the strands binding the gods were tightening in ways that defied all precedent. To the outside world, however, these tensions were invisible. The lands between remained a place of pilgrimage, where knights swore oaths before ancient thrones, and scholars sought fragments of knowledge older than the Erdtree itself. The roads were patrolled by loyal warriors, the skies unbroken by omens, and the Erdtree continued its steady outpouring of blessings. Yet, if one listened closely, the signs were there. Restless storms gathered over Stormvale, as if the land itself groaned beneath the weight of memories too long ignored. In the depths of Caelid, a faint trembling in the earth hinted at a corruption that no scripture could ward off. And in the far north, the nascent Halig tree glowed with Mickella's quiet hope. A hope born not from triumph, but from a longing to escape the very order he was destined to inherit. It is here that the first fracture of the coming catastrophe begins to shimmer. the dawning realization that the Golden Order, for all its grandeur, had no answer for the internal griefs of its own children. Mareeka, whose voice once resonated with divine certainty, had begun retreating into a solitude that neither priests nor knights could penetrate. The two fingers whispered ceaselessly, their guidance growing more insistent, as though they too sensed the drift forming within their god. And Radagon, ever divided between war and devotion, could not hold the realm together as its spiritual foundations quietly cracked. From this quiet dissonance, these subtle shifts in divine intent, these private sorrows hidden behind gilded walls, the shadow of the Shattering began to form, not as a sudden calamity, but as a slow pulse deep beneath the Erd tree's golden roots, a tremor waiting for the single moment when suppression would no longer hold. In the long quiet before the Shattering, when laindell still gleamed beneath the Erd tree's sheltering light, there existed a secret so deeply buried that even the most devout priests dared not articulate it aloud. For as far back as memory reached, death, true, irreversible death, had been bound and controlled, refined into a principle the Golden Order believed it understood. The rune of death, held by Mareeka herself, was the anchor that governed the passing of souls, ensuring that destinies unfolded as the divine will dictated. In those years before catastrophe, the absence of natural death was considered the greatest triumph of the Golden Order. Yet this triumph carried a quiet, accumulating burden. When death cannot act freely, every life continues, not because it must, but because it is forced to remain. Such an imbalance cannot persist without consequence, and beneath the calm of the realm, that consequence was beginning to take shape. To understand how the lands between began to falter, we must first recall the role of the Golden Order's enforcers, the Black Knife assassins, who once served Mareeka with unwavering devotion. These warriors moved unseen through the night, sworn to uphold the balance that the two fingers proclaimed. They were shadows sculpted into purpose, women who bore blades able to cut the soul itself. Yet even they, loyal beyond reproach, felt the tremors of dissonance emanating from the heart of the Order. It is said that the first whispers of rebellion did not begin with anger or ambition, but with a recognition that something in the world had grown unbearably still. The Erd tree's light, once warm with blessing, had begun to feel heavy, unyielding, as though the very concept of change was being slowly suffocated. Within this atmosphere of quiet stagnation, the Numen-born assassins found themselves drawn toward a truth that had been forbidden for generations. They had always served death in its controlled, regulated form, cutting down corrupted figures whose souls needed severing. But what haunted them was the realization that their blades were no longer tools of balance. They had become instruments of preservation, ensuring the realm remained suspended in an unnatural stasis. The Golden Order proclaimed that its design was perfect, unchanging. Yet no world can endure without the cleansing passage of mortality. And in this fragile tension, where perfection could no longer bear its own weight, a single possibility began to take shape. The silent knife could cut the very bond that prevented the world from breathing. The theft itself, carried out on a night remembered only in fearful fragments, was the first irreversible break of the age. The assassins made their way into the sanctum where Mareeka kept the rune of death, isolated from all who might misuse it. How they gained entry remains unrecorded, though some speak of a sympathetic shadow within laindell's halls, someone who recognized that the balance had been broken long before the knives were drawn. What is known is that the Numen blades touched the rune of death and carved away a portion of its forbidden power, lacing their weapons with the essence of true mortality. From that moment forward, the Golden Order's perfection was no longer whole. A single piece removed from the divine mechanism would ripple outward, reaching places the gods themselves could no longer fully control. Yet even with the stolen fragment of the Rune of Death hidden within their blades, the assassins' purpose remained unclear, as though they themselves were instruments of a will larger than any they had ever served. The Golden Order branded them traitors, but their actions bore the unmistakable pattern of beings who understood a terrible truth. The longer the realm remained frozen beneath the Erdtree's unchanging light, the more violently it would eventually collapse. It was not chaos they served, but release. The idea that mortality, rightful and natural, must return to the world before the imbalance shattered everything. But it was the target chosen for the assassin's blade that changed history forever. Godwyn the Golden, beloved heir of the realm, and a symbol of divine promise, fell in the dead of night. His body remained intact, yet his soul was severed. This was a death unlike any seen before. It was a death that did not claim his flesh, but hollowed out the essence within it. Godwyn's empty form lay as though merely asleep, untouched by decay. Only those who understood the deeper laws felt the shift in the world, the sudden void where a soul should have remained. The gods themselves had no answer for this wound. And, in the silence that followed, the Erdtree trembled, not visibly, not in ways the common eye could discern, but deep within its roots, where spirit and destiny intertwine. For Mareeka, the loss of Godwyn was not only the shattering of a son she cherished, but the unmasking of a truth she had worked tirelessly to avoid. By controlling death, she had disrupted the natural weave of life itself, and now that weave was unraveling in a manner neither divine nor mortal could repair. It is said that her grief turned inward, spiraling down into a place where divine purpose and personal anguish collided. The Order demanded stability, yet her heart demanded justice. In this conflict, Mareeka herself began to fracture. The first fracture reflected not in her actions, but in her silence. In the days following Godwyn's death, the corruption began to spread. At first, it manifested as faint, branching tendrils beneath the earth, pale and luminous like veins glowing under skin. But these tendrils were not vessels of life. They were the beginnings of deathroot, the rot that blossoms only when a soul has died improperly, leaving the body behind as an empty conduit. As deathroot crept through hidden chambers and ancient catacombs, the priests of the Golden Order attempted to contain it with rites and incantations, but their efforts failed. For the first time in countless ages, something had emerged that operated beyond the reach of divine decree. The Erdtree, once the bastion of grace, could not absorb a soul that was not truly dead. Godwyn lived without life, an inversion so profound that the cosmic order around him buckled. And though only a handful understood what had truly occurred, the consequences echoed across the lands between. Beasts grew restless. Spirits wandered without settling. Even the stars, which had long whispered their guidance to the astrologers of the north, flickered with unease. The world itself seemed to take a trembling breath, as though preparing for the conflict that would inevitably follow. The Black Knife assassins vanished after their grim work, dissolving into the shadows from which they had emerged. Whether they acted by Mareeka's will, against it, or on behalf of forces unseen, remains a question that scholars debate endlessly. Yet, what is certain is that the assassins had severed the first thread of a tapestry already stretched to breaking. Their act was not merely murder, it was revelation. It exposed the fragility of an order that had claimed perfection. It revealed that gods could be wounded, that divine laws could be broken, and that mortality could return with a sharper edge than ever before. But beneath these political and cosmic tremors was a more personal shift, felt by those closest to Godwyn. His half-brothers and sisters sensed the loss in ways that defied words. Some, like Mickella and Mulaynia, experienced it as a dimming in the world's light, a sorrow woven into their blood. Others felt it as a call, a reminder that their lineage carried both divine grace and an unspoken curse. The demigods, children of fractured divinity, were never united even in times of peace. Godwyn's death did not draw them together. It pushed them toward the precipice from which none would turn back. In the far reaches of the realm, forces long dormant began to stir. The sorcerers of Mulaynia felt the faint shift in the arcane currents that flow through the stars. In Caelid, where the rot simmered like a sleeping wound, the land responded with a quiet shiver. And deep beneath the foundations of laindell, where the ancient roots tangled in labyrinthine depths, the first murmur of something broken rose like a sigh through the stone. It was in this climate of grief, fear, and unraveling order that the seeds of the Shattering took root. Not through war, not through ambition, but through the quiet recognition that the divine protection once believed absolute had failed to preserve even the soul of a single golden sun. And though the realm did not yet know it, the fall of Godwyn was only the beginning. In the weeks following Godwyn's hollowed passing, laindell moved as though under a veil of muffled sound, its rituals continuing in perfect rhythm even as the foundations beneath them began to warp. The Erdtree still shone with its familiar radiance, blanketing the capital in a warm haze that concealed the tremors rippling through its roots. To the citizens who prayed beneath its branches, nothing appeared amiss. Yet in the high chambers where divine authority was meant to speak with clarity, the two fingers fumbled for guidance, their gestures twisting into uncertain shapes. Without the certainty of destiny's voice, the Golden Order's heart faltered, and the first irreversible crack appeared beneath the Golden Throne itself. To understand this change, we must remember that Mareeka had never ruled through gentleness or distance. She was a god who shaped the world actively, carving laws, choosing champions, discarding those who no longer served the greater design. But after Godwyn's death, something inside her shifted so profoundly that even her closest attendants felt the chill. The woman who once spoke with the firmness of ancient stone now carried silence like a shroud. Her footsteps, once purposeful, became slow, measured, almost hesitant, as though each movement required her to weigh the consequences of every breath. The Erdtree's great light touched her no differently than before, yet it no longer illuminated her. It only traced the outline of a figure withdrawing from her own divinity. Radagon, whose union with Mareeka had once been a symbol of unbroken order, found himself standing before a god he could not reach. Their thoughts, once intertwined through grace and purpose, now drifted in conflicting currents. Radagon, ever loyal to the concept of the Golden Order, sought to mend the damage. His prayers echoed through the sanctums. His rituals grew more elaborate, and he stood vigil beside the foot of the Erdtree for nights at a time, waiting for a sign that destiny still walked with him. But the silence offered no comfort. The divine will he once heard so clearly had dimmed to a faint murmur, indistinguishable from the wind that swirled through laindell's highest terraces. Beyond the palace walls, rumours began to coil through the capital like thin strands of smoke. Some whispered that Mareeka blamed herself for the death of her son, that she had foreseen the tragedy yet felt powerless to stop it. Others claimed she had turned away from the guidance of the two fingers, her grief transforming into a quiet defiance. A few even dared to mutter that the god of the Golden Order had fractured into two halves struggling against one another, each bearing a different vision for the future of the world. These whispers were quickly silenced by priests and knights who clung desperately to the illusion of unity, but the doubts remained, growing heavier with each passing day. Far from the capital, the demigods felt the shift in their own ways. In the snow-veiled lands of the north, Ranni withdrew deeper into her studies, her gaze turning toward the distant stars that had always whispered possibilities the Golden Order refused to accept. While the world mourned Godwyn's lost soul, she perceived something more profound, the moment when fate loosened its iron grip. To her, Godwyn's unnatural death was not only a tragedy, but an opening, a widening crack in the cosmic law that had long restrained her. Beneath the pale moonlight, she traced that crack with quiet certainty, sensing that her own destiny lay not in obedience to the Erd tree, but in breaking free from it entirely. In Caelid, the land responded to the imbalance with violent unease. Mulaynia, caught between her love for her brother and the rot that gnawed steadily at her body, felt the world tilt around her. The sickness she bore had always been cruel, but now it seemed to rise in intensity, as though the corruption beneath the earth recognized the weakness in the Golden Order and sought to fill the void. Her spirit, once gentle despite its suffering, hardened into something sharper, more resolute. She had already begun walking the path that would one day define her as the blade of Mickella, a figure of devotion twisted by agony into a force capable of rending armies apart. Yet even she did not know how deeply her fate was now intertwined with the coming war. Mickella himself, ever luminous with quiet purpose, felt the shift not as violence, but as sorrow. The halig tree he nurtured in the distant north trembled with subtle changes, its branches shivering under the faint currents stirred by Godwyn's empty rest. Mickella sensed the wound spreading through the roots of the world long before any scholar could name it. He understood that the Erd tree, for all its brilliance, carried a flaw that could no longer remain hidden beneath the golden canopy. Though still young, he saw a future where the Order's strict dominion would crumble beneath the weight of its own contradictions. And so he poured his gentle will into the halig tree, reshaping it into a refuge that might shelter those the Golden Order could no longer protect. Meanwhile, in distant Stormvale, Godrick the Grafted raged at the heavens with a trembling fury. Godwyn's death did not stir grief within him, but rather a desperate hunger. He interpreted the tragedy as a sign that the age of stable divinity was ending, and he scrambled to carve his name into the widening cracks. His pursuit of strength became feverish, unchecked by wisdom or restraint. Yet behind his grotesque, grafted form, one could sense the quiet truth. He feared being forgotten in a world where demigods were beginning to fracture into rival heirs. His madness was not ambition alone, but terror. Terror of insignificance. Terror of fading into dust, while the world reshaped itself without him. Even the regions untouched by war felt the strain. In the depths of Liurnia, Rennala's academy sensed the shimmering instability of arcane currents. Sorcery, once an art practiced in controlled patterns, began responding unpredictably, reacting to shifts in the cosmic order. Scholars noted anomalies in their star readings, faint distortions in the firmament, as though the celestial bodies themselves were recoiling from the Erd tree's tightening grasp. The Order dismissed these observations as theoretical nonsense, but those who studied the stars knew better. They understood that the heavens had begun to withdraw their guidance in response to a world where death no longer followed its rightful path. Within laindell, the two fingers struggled to interpret the shifting tides, their once confident gestures faltering as though their connection to the greater will had been partially severed. Their failure sent ripples of fear through the ranks of their followers. Priests who once preached with unshakable conviction now stammered through sermons, their voices betraying the uncertainty they tried so hard to conceal. Even the battle mages and knights who patrolled the capital sensed the tension, though they could not explain it. Their dreams grew restless. Shadows seemed sharper. The golden air felt too still, as if waiting for a storm it could not suppress. In this growing unease, Radagon took upon himself the impossible task of restoring balance. He trained tirelessly with blade and prayer, seeking strength in the rituals that once bound gods and mortals. Yet the more he tried to reinforce the Golden Order, the more it seemed to slip through his fingers. His devotion turned into obsession, his prayers into desperate pleas. Those who served him noticed the lines of strain etched into his expression, the way he paused before answering questions, as though uncertain which divine voice, his or Mareeka's, was speaking through him. The duality that had always defined him now pulled him in opposite directions, threatening to tear the Godlord apart from within. No one in Laindell spoke openly about the fear gathering beneath the surface, but the land itself bore witness. The roots of the Erd tree, once conduits of pure grace, twitched with disturbances that echoed beneath the streets. The ash-scented winds that drifted across the capital's high terraces carried faint murmurs that only the sensitive could hear. And deep beneath the city, where forgotten catacombs twisted into hollow caverns, the first hints of deathroot began to pulse, fed by the lingering emptiness of Godwyn's absent soul. Yet even as the world trembled around her, Mareeka remained withdrawn into a silence so profound that it felt like an eclipse of her former divinity. Her attendants could not decipher her thoughts. The two fingers no longer dared to question her. And Radagon, torn between duty and devotion, could only watch as the woman who had shaped the age seemed to recede into a place where no mortal or god could follow. It was in this fragile quiet that the future of the lands between was sealed, not through a single act, but through the accumulation of suppressed truths. Godwyn's hollow death had opened a wound. The rune of death's theft had fractured divine law. The demigods were drifting toward inevitable conflict. And the Golden Order, once a symbol of perfect harmony, was beginning to crumble beneath the weight of its own contradictions. The cracks beneath the Golden Throne were widening. And though no sword had yet been drawn, the shattering had already begun. The death of Godwyn marked a wound so deep that even the Erd tree could not conceal it. In the days that followed, the capital's golden light dimmed almost imperceptibly, as though the tree itself recoiled from what had taken place beneath its vast canopy. No mortal saw the moment Godwyn's soul was torn away. No priest bore witness to the hollowing of the prince who had been beloved across every realm, and yet the air in Laindell felt different, thicker, unwilling, as if the world itself hesitated to breathe. For though Godwyn's body lay untouched, serene as still water, something fundamental had left him, creating a silence that reverberated through every root and every whisper of grace. It is said that Godwyn was the first of the demigods to truly die. But this is not entirely true, for death in its pure form still rested in Mareeka's keeping. What Godwyn suffered was something far stranger, the severing of his soul while his flesh remained. His body did not rot, his skin did not dull, his hair did not grey. The prince whose smile once brightened the halls of Laindell now slept without rest, caught in an eternal stillness that neither prayer nor ritual could disturb. And it was this stillness that terrified the realm more deeply than any battlefield ever could, for it revealed a truth that the Golden Order had long avoided acknowledging. A life without a soul is not life at all, yet a soul that cannot return to the Erd tree disrupts the very laws that bind the world together. Hidden deep beneath the capital, beneath layer upon layer of ancient stone and forgotten crypts, the first tendrils of deathroot began to grow from the place where Godwyn's form was interred. Thin at first, delicate as threads of frost, they crept outward in patterns that defied the natural order. These pale roots branched like twisted veins, glowing faintly with cold luminescence. They did not carry grace. They carried absence, the shape of a soul that had nowhere to go. Priests attempting to purify the chambers felt their incantations die unheard, their sacred seals faltering as though repelled by something far older than the Erd tree itself. And beneath their feet, the deathroot continued its slow, relentless spread, weaving its way through catacombs that had gone untouched since the earliest days of the age. Above these unseen depths, Mareeka faced a grief that could not be spoken. For centuries, she had upheld the Golden Order through deliberate, sometimes ruthless decisions, trusting in divine purpose to justify whatever sacrifices were required. But Godwyn's hollow death was a wound that struck not as a ruler, but as a mother. The prophecy she had shaped, the laws she had carved into the bones of the realm, all felt meaningless before the body of her firstborn son, unmarked by time yet entirely lost. Her attendants saw her withdraw further into herself, her expression never shifting, yet somehow filled with a quiet despair. The silence that had settled over Laindell now emanated from her own stillness, transforming her presence from divine authority into something distant, unreachable. Radagon, bound to Mareeka in ways neither mortal nor divine, could fully comprehend, felt the fracture through the shared essence that linked them. His prayers, once resonant with certainty, now trembled with doubt. He sought guidance from the two fingers, but their gestures were erratic, their whispers muddled, as though even they did not understand the enormity of what had occurred. Godwyn's death had not been written into the grand design. It was an aberration, a break in the cosmic order that no prophecy had foreseen. And in that break, Radagon sensed a shift within Mareeka, a determination that frightened him more deeply than any threat of war. For when a god no longer believes in her own laws, the world built upon them begins to buckle. In the depths of this unfolding tragedy, those closest to Godwyn felt the echo of his hollowing ripple through their own lives. His half-siblings carried the weight of his absence like a shadow trailing them. Renala's children sensed it in the subtle wavering of the stars, their guidance faltering as though the heavens themselves grieved. Ranni felt it as confirmation of a path she had already begun walking, a path toward rejecting a world where even souls could be stolen. Radhan, proud and loyal, experienced it as a tightening in his chest, a sorrow he could not name but could not ignore. He stood beneath the red skies of Caelid, gazing northward toward his fallen brother, unable to comprehend how the world he had vowed to protect could allow such a fate. Even Mulaynia, battling her own torment as the rot slowly claimed her, felt her brother's hollow death like a crack in her spirit. She had always believed that suffering was something she alone carried, a curse that set her apart from the other demigods. But Godwyn's fate revealed that no one, not even the golden child of the realm, was safe from the unseen consequences of divine imperfection. Her sorrow fused with her anguish, shaping the resolve that would one day carry her through storms of scarlet and ash. And Mickella, gentle yet keenly perceptive, understood the truth more deeply than any of them. The Halig tree trembled under his hand as he watched one of its young branches wilt without explanation, its sap running cold. He knew the connection instinctively. The Erd tree had recoiled from the hollowing of Godwyn. A system built on perfect order could not withstand a flaw this fundamental. And so, Mickella poured his strength into nurturing the Halig tree, hoping to create a sanctuary where the principles of grace could be rewritten, where life might grow without the suffocating weight of divine expectation. Godwyn himself, though unresponsive, continued to influence the realm in ways neither god nor demigod could control. As the deathroot spread, it began to twist the earth, birthing creatures who were neither alive nor dead, blasphemous forms that echoed the prince's own liminality. These beings crawled through forgotten tunnels, their movements slow, aimless, driven by the faint echo of a soul searching for a place to rest. Their emergence was the first sign that Godwyn's condition was not merely a tragedy, but a harbinger of transformation that would reach every corner of the lands between. In remote regions, People began to tell stories of restless spirits. Travelers whispered of trees that wept blackened sap. Shepherds reported animals lying motionless in fields, their bodies refusing to rot. These tales spread like smoke through the realm, dismissed by those in power, but believed by those who felt the world shift beneath their feet. And though the Erd tree continued to shine, its light now carried a weight that pressed upon the hearts of all who lived beneath it. Through all of this, Mareeka watched the world she had shaped begin to unravel. She saw how the death of Godwyn exposed the fragility of the Golden Order, how it revealed that the realm she had sought to perfect could not withstand the absence of a single beloved soul. And as she looked upon her sleeping son, his body cold yet unmarked, she understood that the order she had spent centuries enforcing had failed him. It had failed all of them. This realization, quiet yet irreversible, marked the moment when Mareeka's sorrow began to transform into something sharper. Her grief, once silent, turned inward into purpose. For if the Golden Order could not protect the most precious life she had ever brought into the world, then perhaps the world it governed was no longer worth preserving exactly as it was. The Shattering had not yet begun, but the god who once held the realm together had already started to let go. In the long shadow cast by Godwyn's hollow death, the lands between entered a period of stillness so deep it felt like the breath before a scream. The Erd tree continued its radiant glow, yet its warmth no longer flowed with ease. Its light felt strained, taut, like a string pulled too far. Beneath that strained glow, Mareeka's silence became the pulse around which the world turned. She withdrew not only from her attendants and priests, but from the very structure of the Golden Order she had forged with such dominance. What had once been the voice of unshakable divine will now seemed like the echo of a distant memory, fading, fractured, and uncertain. To understand the breaking that followed, we must return to the heart of that silence. For Mareeka was not only a god of law, she was a god who loved her children beyond the understanding of mortals. And in losing Godwyn's soul, taken in a way that violated every law she herself had shaped, she was forced to confront the truth she had hidden, even from her own divinity. The order she built had been forged on the principle of absolute control, where death was bound, destiny written, and imperfections smoothed away by divine decree. But this act of control had become a cage, both for herself and for the world. And now, with her child lying soulless beneath her own shining tree, Mareeka saw that the Golden Order had demanded too high a price. Radagon, her other self and her opposite, could not accept this realization. He clung desperately to the idea that the Order was perfect, that Godwyn's fate was an aberration caused by treachery rather than a flaw in the laws themselves. His devotion hardened into an almost feverish determination to restore the system that had governed the realm for centuries. He prayed without ceasing, his voice rising through the sanctums with a desperation that bordered on pleading. Yet, the greater will offered no comfort, only silence, as though watching to see whether its vessel would bend or break. It was in this tension between Mareeka and Radagon, between despair and devotion, that the Golden Order began to split from within. Their shared existence, once harmonious despite its paradox, now pulled in opposing directions. Mareeka recoiled from the order that had failed her son, while Radagon clung to it with renewed fervor. And in the center of that conflict was a truth that neither dared speak. The god of the lands between was no longer unified in purpose. Even divinity could fracture. The two fingers sensed the divide, though they could not articulate it. Their gestures slipped into frantic, stilted patterns. their once fluent prophecy unraveling into uncertain murmurs. Priests gathered around them, searching for meaning in movements that no longer conveyed certainty. They detected only fragments, a warning without clarity, a plea without direction. And so, the clergy of the Golden Order continued their rituals with increasing urgency, attempting to reinforce a system whose foundation had already begun to crumble. Beyond laindell, the consequences of this divine fracture rippled through the lands. In Mulaynia, the stars flickered in strange formations, their paths diverging from the predictions of Karian astrologers. Ranni, already attuned to celestial signs, recognized this as the moment she had long waited for, the point where fate itself loosened, allowing her to step beyond the boundaries the Golden Order had imposed. The death of Godwyn did not only scar the world, it opened the door to choices the Order had once forbidden. Further south, in laindell's shadowed districts where commoners whispered after nightfall, strange omens began to occur. Birds flew in unnatural patterns. Lantern flames wavered even when still air surrounded them. Children reported dreams of golden roots twisting through darkness, reaching for something they could not grasp. In the tombs beneath Stormvale, warriors swore that echoes of Godwyn's sorrow drifted through the stone, a soft moaning that seemed to seep from roots intertwined with ancient bones. And in Caelid, where the scarlet rot churned beneath the surface like a sleeping storm, Mulaynia felt her affliction intensify. Something in the world's balance had shifted, and the rot, ever hungry, responded to that shift like a beast scenting weakness. She fought its advance with every shred of will she possessed, yet the struggle left her weary, frayed. She began to sense her own path bending toward tragedy, shaped not by her choices, but by the inexorable collapse of the order that had defined her family. Mickella's response was different. Where Mulaynia saw despair, he perceived possibility. He understood, in a way that few others could, that the world had reached a turning point. The Golden Order's perfection was no longer a constant. It was a facade that had finally begun to reveal the fractures beneath its gilded surface. And so, he continued to nurture the Halig tree, pouring his strength into its growth, hoping to create something gentler than the Erd tree's rigid grace. He sensed that the world would soon need a refuge that offered mercy instead of law, kindness instead of control. But the deepest transformation took place within Mareeka herself. Her grief sharpened into clarity, and clarity crystallized into resolve. She recognized that the Golden Order could no longer sustain the world, not because its laws were weak, but because they were too rigid to accommodate the truths that fate had now laid bare. And so she turned her thoughts toward the Elden Ring itself, the vast interwoven system of runes that governed existence. Once, she had shaped it according to the greater will's design. Now, she began to consider what the world might look like if she were to break it. This contemplation marked the true beginning of the Shattering. Not any war, not any blade drawn, but the moment a god questioned the very foundation of her own power. For Mareeka understood that the system she upheld had failed her children, failed her people, and failed the very principles it claimed to preserve. The Elden Ring, magnificent in its complexity, had become a prison that denied the world the freedom to grow, adapt, or heal. She walked the sanctum halls in silence, her steps slow but steady. Attendants watched her pass with bowed heads, unaware that they were witnessing the quiet birth of an intention that would sunder the realm. When she reached the chamber where the Elden Ring lay enshrined, she did not kneel as she once had. She merely gazed upon the runes, glowing, shifting, eternally interlocking, and felt something inside her settle. Not peace, not acceptance, but clarity. She knew now that the perfection she had enforced was an illusion, and that illusions, no matter how radiant, must one day be dispelled. Radagon sensed her thought before she acted. Their shared essence trembled, rippled, threatened to fragment entirely as their opposing wills collided. He tried to reach her, to remind her of their purpose, their oath to the greater will. But Mareeka no longer heard that voice as she once had. Her heart, heavy with a mother's grief, drowned out the call of destiny. And in that final moment, when divine unity dissolved into dissonance, the Golden Order knew, through instinct more than prophecy, that the world was about to change forever. Mareeka lifted her hands, and the first cry of the Shattering trembled through the unseen bonds that held the Elden Ring together. The moment Mareeka struck the Elden Ring was not marked by thunder, nor by any eruption that the people of Laindell could witness. It was instead a silent cataclysm, an unraveling of divine architecture so immense that the world felt it not through sound, but through the shuddering of reality itself. The runes that composed the ring, each a perfect expression of the greater will's law, splintered beneath her hand like threads pulled from an ancient tapestry. What had once been a single, interlocked structure of cosmic authority dissolved into fractured sigils, each one glowing with its own fierce radiance before scattering into the unseen currents that carried grace through the realm. In that instant, the Golden Order ceased to be whole. For Mareeka, that act was both a breaking and a release. Her hand trembled in the aftermath, not from regret, but from the enormity of what she had done. The Elden Ring had been the foundation of the world, law, destiny, life and death, all intertwined. By sundering it, she had not merely defied the greater will. She had ended the age she herself had crafted. Yet she felt no hesitation as the fragments dispersed, carried away like embers from a dying flame. Each fragment bore a different aspect of existence, and as they drifted from the sanctum, the air vibrated with the awakening of countless new possibilities. Radagon felt the breaking as a wound carved directly through their shared essence. He rushed towards the chamber, the glow of the collapsing runes illuminating his path like falling stars. But he arrived only in time to witness the aftermath, a chamber filled with shimmering remnants of divine law, swirling in chaos, as though seeking a new shape. Mareeka stood before him, her form dimly outlined in the fading light, her expression unreadable. And in that moment, their unity shattered completely. The bond that had once made them two halves of a single will dissolved, leaving only opposition in its place. He threw himself upon the scattered Elden Ring, driven not by devotion alone, but by terror. Terror that the order he embodied had been fatally undone. His hands bled as he attempted to gather the fragments, to reconstruct what had been lost. But the runes resisted him, slipping from his grasp, dissolving into light that refused to obey his command. Radagon's desperate plea pulsed through the chamber. A raw and wordless cry aimed toward the greater will. A cry for guidance, for forgiveness, for the strength to piece the world back together. The greater will did not answer, but something of its presence stirred, reaching toward Radagon through unseen channels, weaving into him a purpose that bordered on compulsion. He began to reshape the broken runes, not according to wisdom or unity, but according to the rigid patterns of a will that could not accept imperfection. Where Mareeka had broken the ring out of grief and clarity, Radagon attempted to restore it through denial and desperation. Yet as he worked, it became clear that the ring could not be restored. Not truly. Its fragments were no longer obedient sigils. They had become pieces of a greater truth, liberated from the place they had once occupied. As those divine fragments scattered across the lands between, they fell into the hands, hearts, and destinies of the demigods, each one drawn toward the fragment that mirrored their nature. Though no mortal witnessed their descent, their arrival was marked by tremors in heaven and earth. Storms curled unnaturally around mountaintops. Rivers swelled with light. The air filled with murmurs of ancient lore, awakening long-buried forces. Each demigod, wherever they stood, felt an irresistible pull, a calling that settled upon their shoulders like a mantle they did not choose. Ranni felt her fragment long before it reached her, a sliver of destiny that brushed against her spirit like a cold wind from the stars. Yet she rejected it instantly, refusing the role the Golden Order intended to thrust upon her. The power within the fragment called to her with a voice shaped by the greater will, yet she turned away, letting it fall into the world without a bearer. She desired not dominion, but freedom, and the fragment offered only a gilded cage. In casting off her destined inheritance, she preserved her path toward defiance and set in motion the chain of events that would one day converge at the foot of the moonlit altar. Radhan received his fragment with the weight of loyalty heavy upon him. Ever devoted to his family and to the ancient laws, he embraced the shard not as a claim to power, but as a duty. He sought to stabilize the stars themselves, drawing their wandering paths into stillness so the world could hold its breath without collapsing. Yet in bearing the strength of his fragment, he carried a burden too vast even for him. A burden that would one day drag both body and mind toward a fate as tragic as it was inevitable. Mulaynia's fragment arrived to her like a thread of gold woven through a sea of rot. Its light pierced the suffocating scarlet that enveloped her, illuminating her strength even as her body decayed. Yet, the fragment offered no cure for her suffering, only power. A power she wielded on behalf of Mickella, the only soul she had ever trusted to guide her toward hope. In her hands, the shard became a blade sharpened by devotion, driving her ever closer to the path of bloodshed that would define her as a saint of war. Godrick, upon receiving his fragment, saw not duty or sorrow, but opportunity. The shard burned in his palm like a promise, its light twisting into the shape of ambition. He declared himself heir to the golden lineage, though his claim was unearned and hollow. He turned the fragment into a banner, a justification for the chaos he unleashed as he sought to graft strength into himself from every warrior he conquered. In his madness, he believed he was assembling the power necessary to inherit a broken world. In truth, he was only becoming a reflection of its collapse. And in the far north, Mickella sensed the fragment's descent with both dread and resolve. He feared what the shattering would mean for those he loved, yet understood that the realm had crossed a threshold beyond repair. The halig tree trembled beneath his touch, its leaves whispering faintly with each rune that scattered into the world. He poured his strength into shaping the tree into a haven for any who might seek shelter from the war he knew was coming. But of all the demigods, it was Mickella and Mulaynia who understood most keenly what the breaking meant. They felt the shift deep within their very blood, the dissolution of a divine system that had once defined their existence. And as the world trembled beneath the weight of the shattering, they alone sensed the sorrow that lingered beneath Mareeka's final act. For the shattering was not born of ambition, nor of rivalry, nor of war. It was born of grief, a mother's grief so profound that it broke the law of the world. The fragments scattered, the gods divided, the Golden Order fell into silence, and across the lands between, the first winds of war began to rise. When the Elden Ring shattered, no trumpet sounded across the lands between. No proclamation announced the end of the age. Instead, the world shifted in a way that only the most attuned could perceive, an unmaking that passed like a chill through the roots of the Erd tree and carried itself outward into every creature, every kingdom, every demigod who bore the weight of divine blood. The realm did not collapse all at once. It bent, it groaned, it trembled. And into that trembling silence the first blades were drawn, not from glory or conquest, but from fear. In Laindell, the aftermath of the Shattering began with a single undeniable truth. Mareeka had vanished. Her disappearance was sudden, complete, and without trace. One moment she stood before the fractured remains of divine law. The next, she was gone, swallowed by the vastness of her own despair, or hidden by forces that moved beyond mortal perception. The two fingers writhed in confusion, their gestures collapsing into disordered spirals as they attempted to decipher a fate that had not been foretold. Without Mareeka, the Golden Order lost the center of its gravity. And without that center, everything that had been held together by her will began to drift apart. Radagon, now bound to the remains of the ring he had failed to mend, stood as the last figure of divine authority. Yet his authority meant little in a realm where the sacred law had been broken. He sealed himself within the Erd Tree, not out of cowardice, but out of obligation, an obligation to repair what had been destroyed, no matter the cost to his own soul. His retreat became the final signal to the demigods scattered across the realm. There would be no unifying hand to guide them, no divine judgment to determine succession. Each shard of the Elden Ring had become a claim to sovereignty, and sovereignty demanded conflict. The first whisper of war came from Stormvale. Godrick the Grafted, inflated by the power of his fragment and the delusions it stirred within him, declared himself rightful ruler of the Golden lineage. He mustered knights who still remembered the glory of his bloodline, though their loyalty was brittle, fueled more by nostalgia than conviction. Godrick's proclamation echoed across the realm like a hollow drumbeat. His words bore the shadow of Godfrey's legacy, yet carried none of the first Elden Lord's strength. But for a realm on the brink of collapse, even a weak claim was enough to spark fear. And fear is a tinder that ignites swiftly. In Caelid, Mulaynia remained silent as the proclamations reached her. She cared nothing for the throne, nothing for the squabbling of her siblings. The scarlet rot had hollowed her body until pain became indistinguishable from breath. But when she received word that the demigods were choosing sides, mustering armies, forging alliances in the shadow of the Shattering, she understood that her path could no longer remain isolated. The rot within her throbbed in resonance with the world's unraveling, as though the land itself mirrored her internal decay. And yet she endured, not for the sake of power, but for Mickella, her anchor, her hope, the one soul she believed capable of guiding a broken world toward gentleness instead of destruction. Mickella watched the rise of conflict with quiet despair. He had not sought a throne. He had not desired to inherit the ruins of a shattered age. Yet the demigods who prepared for war were his kin, bound to him by blood and tragedy. The Halig tree he tended shivered with each act of aggression. Its light dimmed in response to violent whispers carried on the wind. Mickella understood that if conflict spread unchecked, the fragile sanctuary he nurtured would not survive. And so he began reaching outward, not with blades or armies, but with intent, seeking those who might still listen to a vision of a gentler world. Far to the north, Ranni observed the unfolding chaos with a calm detached from mortal concerns. She had long rejected the Golden Order's claim over her fate, and now the world mirrored the truth she had recognized long before anyone else. The age of the Erd Tree was ending. Her own plans, woven from threads of moonlight and hidden knowledge, moved in silence beneath the rising storm. While others prepared for war, she prepared for release. a path that would take her far beyond the reach of the Erd tree's fading grace. It was Radhan who first understood the magnitude of the void left by Mareeka's disappearance. As a warrior whose pride was matched only by his devotion to the realm, he sought stability in the constellations that had guided his ancestors. But even the stars had shifted. Their once stable paths had grown erratic, flickering as though uncertain of their own destinies. To anchor them, Radhan invoked power beyond mortal comprehension, drawing celestial forces into his grasp, until his very soul bowed under their weight. He stilled the stars, not out of ambition, but to prevent the heavens from spiraling into chaos. Yet this act chained him to a burden that would one day break his mind, leaving him wandering Caelid's rot-blighted wastes as a shadow of the warrior he once was. Across every realm, small conflicts began to ignite. Knights abandoned their oaths to serve new masters. Sorcerers debated which demigod's fragment held the truest claim. Merchants moved nervously between war camps, sensing profit in the ruin. Even the common folk felt the shift. Crops wilted in the fields, storms gathered without wind, and ancient beasts stirred in long-forgotten caverns. The world held its breath, not in anticipation, but in dread. War did not erupt all at once. It seeped in slowly, like a sickness spreading from wound to limb. The first battles were skirmishes, tests of strength between factions uncertain of their own convictions, but each clash fed the growing fire. Godrick's armies marched from the south, their banners tattered, their spirits wavering, yet driven by a desperate hunger for relevance. In the east, Caelid's soldiers moved like phantoms, their discipline forged in the harshness of a land forever on the verge of decay. In the lakes of Liurnia, knights clad in blue and silver rode out from the academy's shadow, bearing sigils that had once stood for knowledge, but were now instruments of war. The demigods themselves remained distant from these early conflicts, each one grappling with the weight of their newfound fragments. But the world they ruled no longer had the luxury of stillness. Every force that had been held in balance by the Elden Ring, life, death, destiny, and decay, now surged without restraint, colliding in ways no scholar or priest could hope to predict. And beneath it all, a deeper truth pulsed like a heartbeat under the earth. The death root continued to spread. Godwyn's hollowed body, tucked deep in the catacombs below Laindell, grew into something unrecognizable. A great pale mass intertwined with roots that pulsed with unnatural life. His transformation was quiet, unseen, yet it influenced every corner of the realm. Creatures twisted by his lingering essence wandered the night. Spirits lost their path. The boundary between life and death grew thin, fragile, brittle as old parchment. As these shifts deepened, one realization became unavoidable. The world could not return to what it had been. The Golden Order was broken. The gods had fallen into silence. The demigods bore fragments of a legacy none of them understood, yet all felt compelled to claim. And in the spaces where silence once held the realm together, the first blades of the Shattering flashed through the dark, foreshadowing a war that would reduce the lands between to ruin. The Shattering did not begin with a single battle, nor with a declaration audible across the lands between. It began instead with a slow tightening of the world's breath, a gathering of armies under sagging banners, the whisper of steel drawn in uncertainty, the trembling of roots deep beneath the Erd tree as forces older than the Golden Order woke to witness the fall of its children. When the war truly began, it was not marked by triumph or righteous purpose. It was marked by sorrow, carved into every face, every blade, every trembling decision made by those who bore the remnants of divine blood. The demigods had never been a unified family. Their histories were built on alliances of convenience, rivalries born from pride, and bonds strained by divine expectation. Yet as the fragments of the Elden Ring settled into their hands, each demigod felt the pull of destiny like a chain around their throat. None could ignore the truth. The world would demand a new order, and that new order would be shaped by the one who claimed dominion over the broken ring. The greater will had fallen silent. The Erd Tree's grace no longer flowed with certainty, and with Mareeka gone, there remained no arbiter to mediate their conflict. The demigods stood as the last vessels of divine authority, but each one carried wounds that made unity impossible. The first major conflict erupted not on the field of grand armies, but in the storm-battered lands around Stormvale. Godrick, emboldened by his stolen strength and inflated sense of birthright, attempted to seize territory that had once belonged to the Golden lineage. His forces marched with uneven steps. Soldiers cobbled together from trembling knights and desperate loyalists. Yet their advance signaled a shift in the realm. War was no longer a spectre on the horizon. It had arrived. Against Godrick's ambition rose factions whose loyalty bent not toward lineage, but toward survival. Stormvale's defenders, hardened by wind and stone, met Godrick's grafted monstrosities with grim determination. Their cries echoed across cliffs, battered by relentless waves. The first blood spilled on that ancient fortress marked the true start of the Shattering, a struggle defined not by glory, but by exhaustion and loss. By the time the dust settled, Godrick's forces had claimed little, but they had awakened the realm to the inevitability of war. The flames first sparked in Stormvale began to spread. In Liurnia, disputes over ancient lands evolved into bitter rivalries between sorcerers whose loyalties splintered beneath the weight of their own shifting beliefs. Carrion knights, once protectors of the Academy's scholars, found themselves pressed into battlefields where moonlit sorcery clashed with the golden remnants of Erd Tree faith. Great rivers, once used for commerce, became pathways for warships, their hulls creaking under the weight of hastily forged alliances. And yet, perhaps the most devastating battles occurred far from the open plains of Liurnia. In Caelid, war entwined itself with decay until the land itself became part of the conflict. Mulaynia, driven by unwavering devotion to Mickella, commanded an army forged from desperation, a force held together not by ambition, but by loyalty to a future only she could envision. The scarlet rot that tormented her now seeped into the battlefield, turning grass to ash and air to poison. Her warriors marched with faces veiled against the red mists swirling across the horizon, their armor corroded by the rot's touch. Though Mulaynia's leadership burned with ferocity, each victory she won tasted like sorrow, for every battle drove her further from the dreams she had once shared with her brother. She moved across Caelid like a storm. Blades rose and fell in her wake, and with each clash, she felt the rot burrow deeper into her veins. Yet she refused to falter. She fought as though defying fate itself, refusing to let the world swallow her last hope. Her victories were etched in crimson, her losses in silence, and through it all, she carved a path toward Mickella's sanctuary, determined to safeguard the only light left in her life. In the Far East, the war took a different shape. There, warriors of laindell, Caelid, and distant clans clashed in brutal close-quarters combat, their struggles marked by the howls of beasts and the thunder of war elephants imported from lands beyond the realm. Every side claimed to fight for rightful rule, but in truth, no one fought for unity. They fought for fragments, broken runes whose meanings even the demigods barely understood. And throughout this unfolding carnage, Radhan stood as a colossus, his presence casting a long shadow over all who dared enter his domain. His command of gravitational power made him a living anchor of the heavens, yet with each battle, his mind frayed further under the strain of holding the stars in place. He fought, not out of ambition, but out of duty. Duty to a world he believed he alone could steady. His warriors followed him, even as madness crept into his eyes, their devotion rooted in awe and fear. On the plains that would one day bear his name, the earth trembled with each step he took, marking the land with the imprint of a warlord losing himself to the weight of his burden. Still, no force in the lands between matched the quiet influence of Mickella. He refused to take the field, refused to claim a throne, refused to stain his hands with the bloodshed unfolding across the realm. Yet his absence was a force all its own, a silent rebellion against the war tearing apart his family. Warriors who had once pledged themselves to various demigods began drifting toward the Halig tree, seeking purpose in his gentler vision. Some were disillusioned knights, weary of endless battle. Others were common folk who believed the Golden Order's collapse signaled an age where compassion might yet take root. And though Mickella never commanded them as soldiers, their presence grew steadily, forming a quiet legion bound not by conquest, but by hope. The war spread like a wildfire through the realm, but unlike a blaze that consumes everything in its path, this destruction was selective, guided by ancient grudges, wounded pride, and the unspoken grief that weighed upon every demigod. Each battlefield carried echoes of the same question: who among them was worthy to inherit a broken age? Yet the truth was simpler and more tragic than any warrior could admit. None of them were ready. All of them were wounded, and the realm reflected their suffering like a mirror cracked into countless shards. Amid the escalating violence, smaller stories of heartbreak unfolded. Knights who once shared oaths turned their blades against each other in the name of rival demigods. Families abandoned ancestral homes as rivers turned red. Scholars fled burning libraries carrying scrolls that contained knowledge older than the Erd tree itself. Even nature seemed to mourn. Forests grew silent, and the creatures of the wild crept into hidden shelters as the thunder of war shook the air. Throughout it all, the Erd tree stood radiant yet remote, its light flickering with each soul lost to the conflict. The divine brilliance that once inspired unity now seemed to mock the suffering below. Its roots absorbed the grief of the realm without offering any sign of intervention. The greater will remained silent, watching as the world unraveled through the ambitions and tragedies of its own chosen offspring. By the time the war reached its peak, the lands between had become a graveyard of broken dreams. No corner of the realm remained untouched. Every demigod bore scars, some visible, others buried deep within the soul. And though the war raged on with unrelenting force, all who fought within it sensed that the final clash was approaching. The realm could not sustain this endless division. Something would break. Someone would fall. And when that happened, the balance of the age would shift forever. The shattering had begun with silent grief. Now it raged through the land as countless sorrow. The war of the shattering reached its height, not with a single decisive battle, but through a slow erosion of divinity, each demigod unraveling under the weight of their fragment, their grief, and the consequences of choices made by a god who had vanished into silence. The lands between lay bruised beneath the footsteps of armies that no longer remembered why they fought. Every fortress bore scorch marks, every battlefield lay thick with ash, and every river carried traces of blood that had mingled with the soil of countless broken oaths. It was in this world, exhausted, trembling, emptied of certainty, that the demigods themselves began to fall. The first signs of collapse came not from the young or the weak, but from Radhan, whose strength had once seemed beyond measure. His mastery of gravity had anchored the stars, yet that very act, had hollowed him out. His mind strained under the weight of celestial forces, far greater than any mortal or demigod should bear. He camped upon the wastes of Caelid, surrounded by knights who watched with equal parts devotion and dread. They saw how his gaze wandered, unfocused, how his lips moved in murmurs that reached no ears but his own. His body, once immense and proud, had begun to tremble, as though something inside him fought to escape. The stars he had held in place grew restless, tugging at his spirit, until eventually his will could no longer contain them. Madness claimed him. Not the frantic madness of fear, but the slow, crushing descent of a mind collapsing under cosmic strain. When the fall of Radhan became known, it echoed across the realm as the first undeniable sign that even the strongest among the demigods could not survive the shattering unbroken. In the west, the scholars of Mulaynia faced their own tragedy. Ranni had already set her rebellion into motion by casting aside her fragment, rejecting the very destiny the Golden Order sought to place upon her. Her choice created a vacuum within her bloodline. Rennala, once queen and mother, shattered under the weight of loss. Cradling her broken memories within the shimmering shell of her academy, she drifted through the remnants of her life like a ghost. Her pupils wept to see her so diminished, yet could offer nothing but solace in the form of ritual and illusion. And while the Academy's halls glowed faintly with lunar magic, the truth remained. The Carian royal line was fractured beyond mending. The fragment meant for Ranni had no bearer, and in its absence, the magic of the West twisted into a reflection of grief, forever circling the moment destiny had been denied. Stormvale fared no better. Godrick the Grafted, once eager to claim his fragment as proof of divine right, found that the power it offered could not fill the void of his own inadequacy. He grafted limbs upon limbs, spines upon torsos, striving to manufacture the strength he believed he deserved. But each addition only revealed more of his fragility. His armies dwindled, his victories faded, and his name, once invoked with trembling fear, became a lament whispered by those who had hoped for a leader worthy of their devotion. When he finally fell, his throne stood surrounded by pieces of the warriors he had absorbed, their faces frozen in silent accusation. His fragment, still faintly glowing, remained unclaimed as the castle winds carried his final sigh into the unforgiving stone. In Caelid, Mulaynia's decline took a different shape, one driven not by pride or cosmic strain, but by the relentless force of the scarlet rot. Her devotion to Mickella kept her moving long after her strength should have failed. She carved through armies, shattered walls, and faced rival champions with a ferocity that bordered on divine wrath. Yet each victory drained her further, leaving her coughing blood the colour of dying embers. Her warriors followed her with unwavering loyalty, yet even they sensed that she fought less for power and more for the hope that, by sheer force of will, she could reach Mickella's side before the rot consumed her. Her fall came not through defeat, but through exhaustion, her body finally yielding to the affliction that had shaped her entire life. She collapsed upon the threshold of Haligtree's sanctuary, her sword slipping from fingers that had held it far too tightly for far too long. Her soldiers wept, not only for her loss, but for the sorrow carved into her final journey. And Mickella, gentle, brilliant, burdened Mickella, suffered a fate more insidious than any battlefield could offer. He had sought to create a refuge free from the constraints of the Golden Order, a place where suffering could soften and peace could take root. Yet this dream made him a target for forces that operated in silence. In the shadows of the consecrated snowfields, where frost whispered the secrets of forgotten ages, Mickella was taken, carried away into darkness by a figure whose devotion to him twisted into obsession. His loss rippled across the lands between like a mournful bell. Mulaynia felt it in her bones. Knights travelling toward the Haligtree felt the air grow still. Even the roots that wound beneath the earth shuddered, sensing the absence of a soul whose kindness had once offered them quiet hope. Without Mickella's guidance, the Haligtree began to wither, its light flickering like a candle caught in a dying wind. Those who had sought refuge beneath its branches found themselves staring into empty corridors, wondering whether peace had ever been possible. The snow around the tree glowed faintly with the residue of his grace, but it was not enough to soothe the wounds that crept through the realm. As the demigods fell, some to madness, some to sorrow, some to the cruelty of their own blood, the lands between entered an age not of victory, but of ruin. No single power rose to claim the mantle of the Elden Lord. Instead, fragments of the Elden Ring lay scattered among the ashes of battlefields and the ruins of once great kingdoms. The Erd tree's golden glow dimmed further with each passing month, its radiance no longer able to mask the hollowness at its core. Its roots twisted downward as though searching for something they could no longer find. Godwyn's death root pulsed beneath the capital, transforming the very earth into a network of silent grief. Travellers wandering through the crumbling remains of the realm carried tales of strange phenomena, spectral forms wandering aimlessly, as though searching for the path their souls refused to take. Pale flowers blooming from corpses, their petals quivering in unseen wind. Distant drums echoing across canyons where no armies marched. The boundaries between life and death blurred until they became indistinguishable. The lands between existed in a state of suspended mourning, a world neither alive nor fully dead. The demigods had clawed at destiny until their hands bled, each one hoping to seize a claim to sovereignty they barely understood. And in the end, all that remained was the echo of their suffering. They had not become rulers of a new age. They had become monuments to the sorrow that had shattered the old. Yet in the quiet that followed these tragedies, a question began to stir. A question whispered through ruins, through lonely roads, through the hollowed chambers beneath the Erd tree. The war was not yet over, but its end was near, and the realm seemed to wait for something, or someone. Someone who could gather fragments without ambition. Someone who could walk through ruin without succumbing to it. Someone who could see in the ashes not just destruction, but possibility. The lands between held its breath once more, not for the demigods, not for the greater will, but for the figure who would one day step from obscurity into legend. When the last great battles of the Shattering quieted into distant embers, the lands between lay hushed beneath a sky that no longer knew whether it belonged to gods or mortals. The Erd tree loomed overhead, vast, radiant, but strangely hollow, as though its golden light were only an echo of the divinity it once carried with certainty. Its leaves shimmered not with blessing, but with memory, catching the faint winds that drifted from the ruins of battlefields, abandoned fortresses, and roads now claimed by silence. The war had exhausted everything it touched. Kingdoms had been stripped to their stone bones. Armies had been reduced to wandering remnants of oaths that no longer had meaning. The demigods, once towering figures of divine promise, had fallen into sorrow, madness, or oblivion. And the people who survived moved like shadows in the spaces between what the world had been and what it might one day become. To understand this quiet age, we must look first to Laindell, a capital still encircled by golden battlements, yet altered in a way no mortal eye could ignore. The city's great avenues, once thronged with pilgrims seeking grace, now lay sparsely trodden. Knights stood guard out of habit rather than conviction, unsure whether the order they protected still existed at all. The Erd tree's glow bathed the capital in a light that felt weightless, detached. Beneath its branches, the roots pulsed faintly with the sorrow of Godwyn, whose hollow form continued to reshape the depths below. Structures that had endured centuries now carried subtle distortions, as though the world's foundation had shifted a fraction of an inch off balance. Even the air held a different texture, thin, brittle, waiting. Beyond the capital, the Golden Order's influence had fractured into dust. Priests whispered incantations that no longer produced the results they once had. Scholars searched old tomes for explanations that were never written. And in the lands farther from the Erd tree's shadow, belief itself became scattered. Some clung fiercely to the remnants of grace, trusting that the greater will would reassert itself in time. Others renounced the old faith entirely, turning their eyes instead towards sorcery, blood, moonlight, or even the shapeless possibilities that lay beyond the known world. The collapse of divine certainty did not leave a void. It birthed countless small, flickering flames of belief, each one fragile and unsure. The ruins of Caelid stirred uneasily under crimson skies. Where Radhan had fallen into madness, the land now bore scars deeper than any wound inflicted by armies. The rot that spread from its heart grew in strange patterns. Some regions hardened into blackened crust, others pulsed with sickly luminescence. Travelers whispered that if one listened closely, one could still hear the distant echoes of Radhan's last battle, faint as wind curling through abandoned helmets. But beneath the devastation, there lingered a trace of something else, an echo of the warrior's devotion, the imprint of a spirit that had once held the stars themselves in place. Even in ruin, Caelid carried the melancholy grandeur of a land marked by a titan who had tried, against all fate, to protect the realm. In the north, the snowfields stretched in quiet expanses of white, broken occasionally by glimmers of moonlight, reflecting off ancient ruins. Ranni's departure from the lands between left behind a realm touched by serenity and distance. Her followers wandered with measured steps, tending to the traces she had left. Small altars of stone, moonlit sigils carved into frost. Her journey beyond the Erd tree's influence had reshaped the celestial fabric itself, loosening the binds of destiny in ways subtle yet profound. Those who studied the stars reported that their paths, once held rigid by ancient decree, now drifted with greater freedom, like dancers discovering steps long forbidden. The Haler tree, once a beacon of gentle purpose under Mickella's guidance, stood diminished. Its branches drooped, its light faded to a soft, muted glow. Yet the sanctuary it represented had not entirely died. Within its hollow chambers, echoes of Mickella's presence lingered like the scent of a distant spring. Tender, ethereal, refusing to dim completely. Knights who had once pledged themselves to him lingered in quiet vigil, believing that one day the grace he embodied would return. Their devotion, unspoken yet unwavering, formed a fragile thread of hope woven through the shadows of the frozen land. Far below, in the halig tree's twisting roots, the memory of Mulaynia remained like a scar, sharp, luminous, filled with the ache of a warrior who had fought against fate itself. Though her sword no longer carved arcs of crimson light through the mist, those who survived her final march carried her legend in reverent silence. They spoke of a figure shaped by both love and torment, a spirit who had bled herself hollow in her devotion to her brother. And when they passed the threshold where she fell, they left small tokens, broken daggers, tarnished rings, wilted white flowers, each one a gesture of remembrance for a life defined by unbearable sorrow. Stormvale, once thunderous with the ambitions of Godrick the Grafted, stood quiet at last. Winds moved through its ancient halls, tracing the outlines of chambers that had witnessed pride transformed into grotesque desperation. No armies marched through its gates now. No grafted monstrosities stalked its battlements. Instead, the castle's stones seemed to exhale, heavy with relief that the madness which consumed its lord had ended. Travellers who ventured into its shadow-infested corridors spoke of a calm presence lingering in the spaces between silence. Some claimed it was Godrick's last breath, finally freed from ambition that had bound him tighter than any spell. Across the lands between, the remnants of demigod legacies lay scattered like pieces of a broken mirror. Each shard reflected a different truth: tragedy in Caelid, rebellion in the north, desperation in Stormvale, devotion in the Haligtree, and enduring grief beneath Laindell. And it was within this mosaic of sorrow that the world found itself waiting, not for the return of Mareeka, whose fate remained shrouded in divine mystery, not for the greater will, whose silence persisted, but for something quieter, humbler, more human. For the first time in centuries, the lands between gazed not upward toward eternal authority, but outward, toward the possibility that salvation might come not from gods, but from wanderers. Rumours spread of a figure who would one day approach the Erdtree's sealed gates, a traveller from beyond the fog, carrying neither divine lineage nor predetermined destiny. A figure shaped not by prophecy, but by choice. Such tales drifted through inns, across lonely roads, into the hearts of those who had survived the Shattering. They spoke of a future where the broken world might yet be stitched back together, not through divine will, but through the perseverance of those who dared to face the ruins without fear. The Shattering had left the realm fractured, wounded, and silent, but not hopeless. The world waited in its quiet twilight, suspended between the grief of what had been lost and the faint, trembling anticipation of what might still be found. And though no one could foresee the journey that lay ahead, the lands between understood one truth with absolute clarity. The age of gods had ended, and the age of the Tarnished had not yet begun.